Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the grand chandeliers of historical narrative and pull back the silken curtains on something truly intimate. The daily life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Forget the battlefields, the thunderous cannons, the sweeping imperial decrees. Tonight, we're peeking behind the velvet ropes of power, right into his private chambers, to explore the uncharted domesticity of a man who once commanded an empire. You'll find yourself standing by his bedside as the first sliver of dawn breaches the heavy drapes, smelling the faint scent of stale coffee and ambition that clung to his imperial linens. You'll witness the small, almost mundane choices that shaped the day of a man who shaped the world. You probably won't survive this journey completely unchanged, I promise. Your perception of history, and maybe even your breakfast, will never be quite the same. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling extra cozy, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the chill, pre-dawn air of the Tuileries Palace, or perhaps Malmaison, depending on the year and the shifting tides of imperial life. The heavy velvet drapes are still drawn tight against the world, holding the last vestiges of night within the room, creating a hushed, almost sacred space. A faint dancing glow from a single candle on a nearby ornate table flickers, casting long, dramatic shadows that play across the rich tapestry of the wallpaper, making the classical scenes seem to subtly shift and breathe. You can almost hear the rhythmic, insistent ticking of a forgotten mantle clock, a quiet, metallic pulse that marks the passage of moments even before the emperor stirs. This isn't the grand, bombastic awakening you might conjure in your mind. For a man who bestrode Europe like a colossus, who bent nations to his will, there's no dramatic trumpet fanfare, no legionnaires standing at rigid attention outside the door, no immediate flurry of activity. Instead, it's remarkably, almost shockingly, quiet. This stillness is broken only by the almost imperceptible rustle of a servant, usually his ever-present and discreet valet, Louis Constant Wary, tiptoeing in constant moves with the practiced grace of a shadow, carefully lighting more candles with a small taper, chasing away the deepest pockets of gloom. And then, with precise movements, opening a single shutter just enough to allow a tantalizing sliver of soft, grey light to pierce the heavy gloom. This sacred moment of imperial awakening usually occurs with surprising regularity, around 6 or 7 in the morning, though you know, with the intuition of an intimate observer, that this schedule could be brutally curtailed if a significant military campaign or an unfolding political crisis demanded his immediate and undivided attention. You watch as Napoleon, a man whose intense gaze alone could make seasoned generals tremble and diplomats sweat, slowly pushes himself up from the vast, canopied bed. His posture might seem a little stiff, a little less than perfectly agile. Perhaps from the previous day's relentless exertions, more likely from the sheer, crushing weight of the empire that rested squarely upon his surprisingly compact shoulders. He didn't linger in bed, ever. There was no luxurious stretching, no languid turning over. His mind, it seems, was always several steps ahead of his body, already plotting the next strategic move, already calculating the geopolitical chess game that consumed his waking hours. His waking routine was Spartan, almost monastic in its simplicity. He'd often start his day with a brisk, almost perfunctory wash, certainly not a leisurely, indulgent bath filled with perfumed oils, as was fashionable among many of his royal counterparts. Historians still argue whether his infamous aversion to prolonged baths was due to a genuine, inexplicable dislike of immersion in water, a pragmatic and deeply ingrained disinterest in anything that consumed time unnecessarily, or perhaps even a deep-seated fear of illness transmitted through stagnant water. Regardless of the reason, it was always a brisk affair, often with just a splash of water, a quick dousing with eau de cologne, and a remarkably swift shave performed by Constant, who handled the sharp razor with the confidence born of years of daily practice. You might even notice his hair thinning a little at the crown, a very human sign of aging, but still with that iconic, slightly tousled look. The very coiffure that would become instantly recognizable in portraits for centuries to come. Then came the dressing, a ritual performed with precision, if not with great ceremony. You watch as he pulls on his simple, strikingly practical uniform, often the dark green of the chasseurs cheval of the Imperial Guard, or perhaps a more understated civilian suit, typically blue or grey. This wasn't about fashion statements or opulent displays. It was fundamentally about function, about readiness, about the uniform of command. He possessed dozens, if not hundreds, of identical outfits, a testament not to vanity, but to his profound desire for efficiency and uniformity. In all things, you might even catch a fleeting, almost imperceptible yawn from him. A very human gesture from a man often portrayed as superhuman, an unflappable force of nature. He rarely wore extravagant silks or intricately embroidered waistcoats for daily wear. His sartorial choices were as direct, as unpretentious as his military strategies. He was, in a very real sense, already in uniform for the day's battle, even if that battle was fought not with swords and muskets, but with quills and dispatches, with diplomatic notes and the relentless pressure of decision-making. It's a mainstream historical fact that his wardrobe was remarkably consistent, eschewing the sartorial flamboyance of many of his contemporaries, favoring function over ostentation. And here's a quirky tidbit. He reputedly had a habit of pinching his earlobe when deep in thought, a small, unconscious, almost childlike gesture you might now observe. A fleeting tick as he finishes buttoning the last button of his tunic, his mind already miles away, already immersed in the colossal tasks that awaited him. The air in the room, once still and silent, now begins to thrum with the quiet energy of an awakening emperor. As the first rays of morning light truly begin to filter into the room, painting stripes across the polished floorboards and highlighting the intricate details of the furniture, you observe Napoleon moving, not with frantic haste, but with a deliberate, almost surgical energy. His mind, even at this earliest hour, is clearly already engaged, already worried, like a finely tuned machine preparing for a colossal task. The first stop after his Spartan toilette was almost invariably his study, not the breakfast table. This was a man who, quite literally, fed his ambition before he fed his stomach, prioritizing intellectual and strategic nourishment over mere physical sustenance. You watch him enter the room, the scent of fresh paper and beeswax mingling with the faint lingering aroma of his cologne. He doesn't sit immediately. He often walks straight to a table laden with maps, his fingers tracing imaginary lines of advance, or stands before a window, gazing out at the burgeoning day, his thoughts already miles away, perhaps across the Channel or deep into the heart of Europe. The air in the study crackles with the quiet, almost palpable intensity of pure concentration. He'd often be standing, sometimes pacing with those short, rapid steps that were so characteristic of him as he worked, his small, sturdy frame radiating an almost palpable kinetic energy, an internal dynamo that never seemed to switch off when breakfast finally arrived. It wasn't a lavish affair with a grand spread worthy of a king, piled high with delicacies from across his vast empire. Oh no, not for Napoleon. You watch as Constant, his ever-present valet, with his customary quiet efficiency, brings in a simple tray. It's a far cry from the opulent feasts you might associate with the Sun King, Louis XIV, or the indulgent banquets of other European royalty. His morning meal was, by all accounts, remarkably consistent, strikingly understated, and eaten with a speed that defied polite society. You'll notice the steam rising from a small, often plain, cup of coffee, usually strong and black, and perhaps a little bit bitter, much like the harsh realities of his world and the difficult decisions that awaited him. Alongside it, often just a slice or two of plain bread, sometimes lightly toasted, and occasionally a single soft-boiled egg, still in its shell, testament to its freshness. That's it. No elaborate pastries, no exotic fruits from distant colonies, no vast piles of cured meats or rich cheeses. This, you realize with a sense of quiet astonishment, was the unadorned breakfast of a man who saw food primarily as fuel, as a necessary input for his extraordinary output, not as a source of prolonged indulgence or sensory pleasure. It's a mainstream historical fact that he preferred simplicity in his diet, especially in the mornings, believing that heavy or complex foods dulled the mind. You might even catch a subtle glimpse of him with an almost childlike gesture, dipping his piece of bread into his coffee, a surprisingly common habit of the era, and one that feels oddly intimate to witness from such a monumental figure. This remarkable consistency in his breakfast, and indeed his entire morning routine, wasn't just about his taste. It was deeply intertwined with his temperament and his strategic mindset. He was, above all, a creature of habit, and his daily routine was meticulously crafted, almost surgically optimized, to maximize his productivity and mental clarity. He didn't waste precious mental energy pondering what to eat or how to prepare it. The decision was already made, immutable, freeing his powerful mind for grander concerns. Think about it. How much mental bandwidth do you dedicate each morning to the intricate ritual of deciding on breakfast, preparing it, and savoring it? For Napoleon, that precious cognitive energy was reserved for calculating troop movements, drafting new legal codes that would reshape an entire continent, or contemplating the fate of nations. This isn't to say he was entirely devoid of culinary preference, of course. He had a particular, enduring fondness for Chambertin wine, but that was reserved for later in the day. After the serious work was done, a small, earned luxury, and here's a quirky tidbit that might just make you chuckle, revealing a very human impatience beneath the imperial granite. Despite his powerful position, his legendary patience for grand strategy seemed to evaporate at the breakfast table if his food wasn't served promptly, or if something was even slightly off. The coffee not hot enough, the bread not fresh enough. He could become noticeably irritable, a low grumble rumbling in his throat. Imagine the man who could stare down entire armies, who could calmly orchestrate complex military maneuvers involving hundreds of thousands of men, could be visibly vexed by a cold piece of toast or a delay in his morning coffee. It adds a wonderfully, almost comically, human touch to his otherwise formidable and often intimidating persona, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether his notoriously rapid consumption of food was a direct sign of his general impatience, a frantic desire to move on to the next monumental task, or a reflection of his constant internal drive, always eager to leap into the fray of his imperial duties. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a confluence of personal disposition and professional necessity. You sense the urgency even in the quiet act of him consuming his simple meal, his intense gaze already drifting back towards the burgeoning piles of documents awaiting his immediate, incisive attention. The coffee cup is emptied quickly, the bread devoured with a few decisive bites, and almost as soon as it arrives, the tray is being cleared away. The emperor is ready, fueled by ambition and a surprisingly humble breakfast for the relentless demands of the new day. With his simple breakfast dispatched and the last crumbs swept away by constant with almost surgical precision, you watch as Napoleon pivots seamlessly from basic sustenance to the grand, demanding stage of strategy and governance. This is where the true engine of the empire began its daily roar, where the gears of ambition and intellect meshed in a symphony of control. He didn't ease into his work, gently warming up to the tasks at hand. He plunged headfirst into it, immediately immersed in the torrent of reports, dispatches, and policy decisions. The study, which moments before was a quiet tableau of morning light, now becomes a whirlwind of activity, though remarkably, almost miraculously, organized. You see not chaos, but a meticulously orchestrated performance of intellectual might, a controlled explosion of thought and action. His desk, often surprisingly clear save for the immediate documents he was working on, was a testament to his orderly mind, a stark contrast to the cluttered workspaces of many academics or bureaucrats. Papers were brought in, always by Constant, or a trusted chief secretary, in precise, categorized stacks, each one a potential challenge or opportunity for the emperor. He rarely remained seated for long periods. You'll notice him pacing, his short, rapid steps echoing softly on the polished wooden floors, a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, or standing, leaning intently over the large, detailed maps that were perpetually spread out on tables, sometimes even unfurled directly onto the floor, transforming the room into a giant chessboard. This was his preferred mode of operation, mobile, dynamic, mirroring the very armies he commanded across the vast plains of Europe. He wasn't a man to recline idly in an armchair and leisurely read reports, much less delegate all reading to others. Each document, each letter, each dispatch, no matter how seemingly minor, was treated with intense scrutiny, devoured by his sharp intellect. You can almost feel the tangible weight of his gaze as he absorbed the information, his mind processing it at an astonishing, almost frightening speed, filtering out the irrelevant, honing in on the critical details. It's a mainstream historical fact that Napoleon had an almost superhuman capacity for work, often putting in 16-hour days, sometimes even more during periods of intense campaigning or crisis, seemingly impervious to fatigue. He possessed the astounding ability to dictate letters simultaneously to multiple secretaries, each scribe furiously scratching away as Napoleon seamlessly switched from one complex topic to another. A truly remarkable feat of multitasking that speaks volumes about his unparalleled mental agility and control. The sheer volume of work he got through daily is staggering, almost unfathomable to a modern mind. He wasn't just signing off on things, rubber stamping proposals. No, he was actively involved in every facet of governance, from the minute logistics of military supply lines to the grand intricacies of civil administration, from the high-stake chess game of foreign policy to the precise drafting of judicial reforms. You see him making copious marginal notes, his thoughts spilling onto the broad margins of official documents, his handwriting famously notoriously illegible to anyone but his most experienced and long-suffering secretaries. He demanded brevity and clarity in all communications, and woe betide any official who dared to present him with verbose, flowery reports or lengthy, meandering analyses. He wanted the essence, the unvarnished facts, stripped bare of any superfluous language or bureaucratic fluff. This almost brutal insistence on conciseness was another manifestation of his relentless pursuit of efficiency, a distillation of information to its purest, most actionable form. And here's a quirky tidbit that adds a surprising sensory detail to his intense work sessions. He often chewed on licorice root or occasionally took a pinch of snuff, not in a crude or messy way, but rather as an aid to concentration, a small, repetitive action that might have helped to keep his restless mind anchored to the immediate task at hand. A tiny, almost imperceptible ritual in the grand drama of his day. Imagine the master of Europe, the architect of a new world order, gnawing thoughtfully on a stick of licorice while deciding the fate of nations, or taking a quick pinch of snuff to clear his head before signing a decree that would impact millions. It's a small, intimate detail that makes him feel profoundly, almost touchingly human, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether his legendary short temper, which sometimes flared during these intense work sessions, manifesting as a sharp retort or an impatient gesture, was a genuine, volatile personality trait, or if it was a calculated tool, a deliberate display designed to keep his subordinates perpetually on their toes, ensuring maximum efficiency and unwavering loyalty. You might see a sudden flash of irritation cross his face as he underlines a poorly worded sentence with unnecessary vigor or impatiently waves away a suggestion he deems foolish or ill-conceived. This was not merely work, it was a performance, a continuous, exhausting exertion of will and intellect that defined his very existence. The morning, for Napoleon, was a period of intense creation, a time for building empires. One document, one incisive decision, one dictated word at a time. Each action forging another link in the chain of his boundless ambition. As the morning's intense work sessions, a maelstrom of dispatches and decisions, finally bled into midday, you might notice a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the palace's rhythm. The urgent, frantic rush of the early hours mellowed slightly, like a fever breaking, but the emperor's formidable focus remained unwavering. A laser beam fixed on the intricate machinery of his empire. Lunch, when it eventually came, was not a grand, leisurely break from his overwhelming duties, nor was it a time for frivolous diversion. Instead, it was often, and most pragmatically, an extension of them. You wouldn't find Napoleon retreating to a separate, opulent dining room for a prolonged, relaxed meal with family or courtiers, at least not typically, certainly not during his most active years. Rather, the midday repast was usually served in his study, right there amidst the maps and papers, or in a very sparsely furnished adjoining room where he could easily, almost instantly, return to his urgent papers and unread reports with barely a wasted step. You watch as Constant, with his customary quiet efficiency and near telepathic understanding of his master's needs, brings in the lunch tray. Again, the emphasis is profoundly on simplicity and, crucially, on speed. This wasn't a time for elaborate presentations, for culinary artistry, or for savoring rich flavors. A plain plate of chicken, often roasted or boiled, never too heavily, seasoned, accompanied by some simple, steamed vegetables, and sometimes a clear, unadorned soup, were common fare. He favored straightforward, wholesome dishes, nothing too heavy or complicated, precisely the kind of food that wouldn't slow down his agile, perpetually churning mind. It's a mainstream historical fact that Napoleon ate incredibly quickly, often astonishing those around him by finishing his entire meal in a matter of mere minutes, sometimes even under 10 minutes. He was known to literally bolt his food, devouring it with a speed that left companions bewildered and chefs exasperated. Imagine trying to keep pace with the Emperor of France as he devoured his chicken and peas with the single-minded focus of a hungry wolf, his attention already half returned to the state of his armies or the latest diplomatic overture. This almost shocking rapidity in his consumption wasn't just a quirky habit. It was deeply ingrained in his very character and reflected his strategic approach to every aspect of life. Time, for Napoleon, was the most precious commodity, a non-renewable resource to be husbanded with extreme, almost obsessive care. Every moment not spent on governing, strategizing, or learning was, in his view, a moment wasted, a slippage in the grand march of his ambition. Even at the table, his mind was likely still turning over the complex problems of the empire, dissecting the latest intelligence reports from distant fronts, or meticulously planning the next audacious military maneuver. You can almost see the internal gears turning furiously behind his intense, often unblinking eyes, even as he raises a fork to his mouth, his jaw working with quick, decisive movements. And here's a quirky tidbit about his surprisingly specific culinary preferences. He was famously, almost quaintly, fond of potatoes and often ordered them prepared in various, simple ways. This might seem incredibly mundane for a man of his stature, accustomed to the finest ingredients in Europe, but such simple, almost rustic preferences stand out against the backdrop of elaborate courtly dining and the rich, complex dishes favored by other monarchs. He also had a particular, almost visceral, dislike for gravy and rich sauces, preferring his food plain, unadorned, allowing the natural flavors to come through. Historians still argue whether his rapid eating was a direct product of his campaigning habits, where meals were often snatched quickly between battles or during forced marches, a necessity that became ingrained, or if it was simply a fundamental part of his impatient and inherently driven personality, a man always in a hurry. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a trait honed on the chaotic battlefield and then brought back, undiminished, to the formal setting of the palace. Regardless, his midday meal was never a moment of true relaxation or culinary exploration. It was much more akin to a refueling stop, a necessary, almost grudging pause before he plunged back into the demanding, relentless currents of imperial governance. You sense that even his digestion was probably on a forced march, processing his food with the same efficient haste he applied to everything else. Having replenished his physical energy, however swiftly and unceremoniously, Napoleon's insatiable mind then turned to another kind of nourishment, one that fueled his strategic genius even more profoundly: words, ideas, and the accumulated knowledge of the ages. You observe him moving from his desk, perhaps with a slight stretch, to the sanctuary of his library, a place that, despite the grandeur of his various palaces, the Tuileries, Fontainebleau, Malmaison, felt intensely personal, a private, intellectual refuge amidst the public spectacle of empire. This wasn't a mere collection of books for show, a decorative backdrop for imperial pronouncements. It was a working library, a testament to his voracious, almost obsessive appetite for reading and learning. He held a profound, unwavering belief that knowledge was power, and he consumed books with the same strategic intensity and ruthless efficiency he applied to military campaigns and political negotiations. His personal library was vast, encompassing thousands upon thousands of volumes, reflecting an astonishingly eclectic range of interests that defied the narrow confines of military or political thought. You see shelves groaning under the literal weight of history books, meticulously organized alongside biographies of great commanders like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, whose exploits he studied with almost religious fervor, but mixed in were philosophical treatises, profound works by Rousseau and Montesquieu, weighty legal texts that informed his monumental civil code, detailed scientific works, and even, surprisingly, novels and poetry, revealing a hidden breadth to his intellectual curiosity. It's a mainstream historical fact that he took his intellectual pursuits on the road. He famously traveled with a portable library on his campaigns, a carefully curated collection of hundreds of books packed into custom-made, sturdy wooden cases, proving beyond doubt that his intellectual cravings were not confined to the quietude of the palace, but were an integral part of his very existence, whether in camp or court. Imagine trudging across the harsh landscapes of Europe with an army of hundreds of thousands, and still making sure your copies of Plutarch's Lives and Voltaire's Candide were within arm's reach. You might find him not just perusing or casually flipping through pages, but actively engaging with the texts, almost as if in a silent, vigorous debate with the author. He wasn't a passive reader, merely absorbing information. You'd often see him making copious, sometimes furious, notes in the margins, scrawling his thoughts with a pen, or, if no writing implement was handy, sometimes even scratching directly onto the paper with his fingernail, a testament to the immediacy of his ideas. These notes weren't always neat. They were often bursts of raw thought, incisive arguments, sharp critiques, or profound observations, reflecting a mind constantly at work, challenging, analyzing, synthesizing information, always looking for applications to his present dilemmas. He had a particular, almost spiritual, fondness for works on military strategy and ancient history, constantly seeking parallels, drawing lessons from the successes and failures of the past to apply directly to his contemporary circumstances, believing that human nature and the principles of power remained constant across millennia. You might even hear him mutter aloud, arguing with the long-dead authors, interjecting his own opinions, a truly peculiar and captivating habit for an emperor, revealing the vibrant internal dialogue that was his constant companion. Here's a quirky tidbit that underscores his intellectual urgency. If he encountered a book he particularly liked or urgently needed for a current problem, but didn't have with him in his immediate collection, he wouldn't hesitate to send a courier hundreds of miles, even across borders, to fetch a copy. If the book was out of print or rare, he would even demand that a new copy be printed specifically for him, sometimes within days, illustrating his impatience for knowledge. His intellectual cravings were as urgent and demanding as his strategic demands on his generals. Historians still argue whether his extensive, almost encyclopedic, reading was primarily for purely practical, military and political insights, a pragmatic tool for governance and conquest, or if he also sought a broader, intellectual and philosophical understanding of the human condition, a deeper wisdom to guide his monumental life. Perhaps it was a perfect, synergistic blend of both, a quest for both actionable knowledge and profound wisdom, all in service of his grand designs for France and Europe. you sense the profound depth of his intellectual hunger, a boundless desire to absorb everything, to understand the world from every conceivable angle, to dissect its complexities and master its principles, all to better wield his immense power. The soft rustle of turning pages, the almost imperceptible scratch of his pen, the occasional murmured thought, these were the quiet, constant sounds of a mind that never truly rested, always building, always learning, always conquering, even within the confines of his own library. After hours immersed in the relentless churn of strategy and the profound depths of the printed word, you'd typically find Napoleon turning to his chosen elixirs, the liquid fuel that sustained his formidable pace and sharpened his already incisive intellect. These weren't mere indulgences, casual sips to pass the time, but rather vital components of his daily intellectual regimen, almost as important as the dispatches themselves. You witness him, perhaps back at his desk, the scattered papers still, demanding his attention, or still standing among his beloved, towering stacks of books, reaching for his preferred beverages, and at the top of that rather select list, without a doubt, was coffee. He was, by all accounts, a veritable coffee fiend, a caffeine connoisseur of the most intense order, not a delicate, frothy latte kind of coffee, or a gently brewed artisanal pour-over. No, his preference was for coffee that was unyieldingly strong, profoundly black, and often consumed in rapid succession throughout the day, a constant, dark companion. You can almost smell the rich, dark, earthy aroma wafting through the imperial chambers, mingling with the scent of old paper and leather. It's a mainstream historical fact that he relied heavily, almost dependently, on coffee to maintain his astonishing focus and unwavering energy, particularly during his marathon work sessions that stretched late into the night and his arduous, demanding deliberations. His valets, particularly Constant, knew instinctively to keep a pot brewing constantly, the dark liquid bubbling softly, always ready to refresh his cup at a moment's notice without even being asked. For a man who rarely allowed himself to be seen in moments of weakness or fatigue, who projected an image of tireless, unyielding power, coffee was his silent ally, the dark, stimulating draught that kept his formidable intellect cutting through complexity with ease. You might even imagine the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he raises the cup to his lips, a small, subtle concession to the immense, crushing pressure under which he operated, the constant demands on his mind and body. Then there was the cognac. This wasn't a daily habit in the same compulsive way coffee was. It was more of an occasional, strategic indulgence, but it played a significant role, particularly in the evenings, after the day's heaviest burdens had been shouldered, or following a particularly demanding stretch of work or a grueling strategic session. You might see him taking a small glass, perhaps swirling the deep amber liquid slowly, thoughtfully, watching the way it caught the candlelight, the complex scent of grapes and oak mingling richly in the air. For Napoleon, cognac wasn't primarily about outright intoxication or escape from reality. It was often viewed as a restorative, a potent digestive to aid his often troubled stomach, or a small, well-earned comfort after the immense mental strain of his day. It's a quirky tidbit that he rarely drank wine during the day, preferring plain water for its clarity and purity. But cognac was his spirit of choice, his singular vice, if you could even call it that. He appreciated its warmth, its immediate yet subtle effect, and perhaps the very subtle sense of command it invoked, a feeling of mastery even over his own senses. He reputedly believed it had medicinal properties, a common belief at the time. seeing it as a tonic rather than merely an alcoholic beverage. Historians still argue whether his significant reliance on these stimulants, especially the copious amounts of coffee, contributed to his often mercurial moods, his famed irritability, and the intense periods of activity that sometimes seemed to be followed by sudden, profound exhaustion. Was the coffee a crutch, a physiological dependency that shaped his daily rhythm, or simply a sensible and entirely pragmatic aid to an already prodigious, almost inhuman work ethic? Was the occasional cognac a controlled unwinding, a calculated release of tension, or a slight, gradual loosening of the iron grip he held on himself and his emotions? Regardless of the precise interpretation, you can see these beverages as more than just simple drinks. They were deeply integrated into his very being, woven into the fabric of his imperial existence, providing the necessary jolt to initiate action or the gentle bomb to navigate the treacherous waters of his heist life. The subtle clink of a coffee cup against a saucer, the quiet, almost reverent pour of amber liquid into a crystal glass. These were the subtle yet persistent sounds of an emperor maintaining his dominion, not just over a sprawling empire, but over his own relentless, unyielding mind. As dusk began to settle over the imperial city, casting long, ethereal shadows across the palace gardens and painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet, a subtle yet significant shift in Napoleon's daily rhythm occurred, marked by the arrival of the evening meal. Dinner was perhaps the most social, yet still intensely pragmatic, part of his day. Unlike the hurried, almost Spartan breakfasts and lunches, dinner allowed for a slightly longer pause, a brief respite, often shared with a select group of trusted ministers, seasoned marshals, or close family members. Yet, even here, at the ostensibly convivial dinner table, the imperial mind was still relentlessly at work, transforming a simple act of eating into an extension of his political arena, a subtle theater of power you watch as he takes his place at the head of a relatively small table compared to the sprawling, elaborate banquets common among other European monarchs of his time. He consistently preferred intimacy, even in formal settings, believing it allowed for more direct conversation, more incisive questioning, and sharper observation of those around him. The dishes served were usually well prepared, reflecting the skill of his imperial chefs, but they were almost never overwhelmingly extravagant or excessively rich. You might see a perfectly roasted joint of meat, perhaps lamb or beef, prepared simply alongside seasonal vegetables picked fresh from the palace gardens, perhaps a clear, warming soup to start, and a modest, uncomplicated dessert to finish. It's a mainstream historical fact that he maintained a relatively simple and consistent diet even in the evening, a stark contrast to the often gluttonous habits and elaborate, multi-course feasts of many of his aristocratic peers. He ate quickly, as always, a habit so ingrained it was almost involuntary. But he was also a keen, almost microscopic observer of those around him, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He listened intently to conversations, gauging reactions to his pronouncements, subtly assessing the loyalty and intelligence of his companions, and with an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist or a raised eyebrow, steering discussions towards topics of state, military strategy, or unfolding political dilemmas. This was less a purely social gathering and more a highly strategic council, brilliantly disguised under the veneer of conviviality and shared sustenance. You'd often hear him interjecting with sharp, probing questions, designed not just to gather information but to test the knowledge, the quickness of mind, and the unwavering loyalty of his companions. He might use the opportunity to subtly float new ideas, to gauge the political climate among his inner circle, or to deliver veiled instructions that were understood without the need for formal decree. The dinner table, under Napoleon's discerning eye, became a subtly powerful stage for his influence, a place where he could exert his will not through direct command, but through conversation, through the sheer force of his presence, and through the almost magnetic pull of his intellect. Imagine trying to enjoy your dinner while the fate of a nation, or perhaps your own career, might hinge on your answer to a seemingly casual question from the emperor, delivered between bites of roasted chicken. And here's a quirky tidbit that reveals a surprisingly sensitive palate beneath the unyielding exterior. He had a particular, almost pathological aversion to garlic and onions. If a dish contained even the slightest hint of these ingredients, he would immediately refuse to eat it, pushing the plate away with a dismissive gesture. This seemingly trivial personal preference could actually cause quite a stir in the imperial kitchens, sending frantic whispers among the chefs and ensuring that his meals were prepared precisely to his rather specific, almost idiosyncratic tastes. Historians still argue whether his strict table etiquette, his remarkably fast eating, and his almost imperceptible control of dinner conversations were purely personal traits, reflection of his impatience and disciplined nature, or a calculated display of efficiency designed to subtly intimidate and control his dinner companions, ensuring discussions remained focused, brief, and always on his terms. You sense a subtle tension in the room, even amidst the gentle clinking of silverware and the low murmur of voices. A palpable awareness that every word spoken, every gesture made, was being observed, assessed, and perhaps even filed away in the prodigious memory of the emperor. Dinner for Napoleon was never just about the food. It was about the continuous, relentless exercise of his formidable will and his unending quest for control. With the political dinner concluded, the strategic conversations fading into the background like the distant clinking of dishes, Napoleon's attention would often turn inward to the very fabric of his personal presence, the subtle details of his daily upkeep that maintained his formidable public image. You might instinctively think that a man who shaped countenance and commanded vast armies would be utterly indifferent to such mundane matters as clothing, grooming, or personal hygiene, seeing them as trivial distractions. But you'd be profoundly mistaken. His approach to dress and decorum was, like everything else in his meticulously constructed life, a direct reflection of his strategic mind and his deep, almost intuitive understanding of public perception and personal discipline. You observe him as he sheds the layers of his uniform, perhaps with a subtle sigh of relief, the heavy wool and brass buttons giving way to simpler, more comfortable attire. His undergarments were surprisingly simple, functional, made for comfort rather than display. He wasn't one for luxurious silks or elaborate lace in his private moments, preferring utility and ease of movement even in the sanctity of his own chambers. It's a mainstream historical fact that he consistently preferred comfort and practicality in his clothing, both for public and private wear, eschewing the stiff, uncomfortable fashions of the aristocracy. You might notice the almost ritualistic, meticulous folding of his discarded garments by his valet, a small, telling detail that hints at the profound order he demanded in all aspects of his life, from the grandest military maneuver to the disposition of his socks. His valets, particularly Constant, were masters of efficiency, ensuring his extensive wardrobe of identical uniforms, each one a precise replica of the last, right down to the buttons, was always immaculately prepared, pressed, and ready at a moment's notice. This almost obsessive uniformity wasn't just about efficiency. It powerfully projected an unchanging image of consistent power, unwavering resolve, and a sense of timeless authority. He was always, unequivocally, Napoleon, instantly recognizable, eternally in command, a living symbol of the French nation. Beyond the clothes, his personal hygiene was a curious, almost paradoxical blend of imperial decree, practical necessity, and individual quirks that would perplex many today. While he didn't luxuriate in elaborate baths as often as some might prefer, or as was becoming fashionable among the more fastidious, he was nonetheless fastidious about personal cleanliness, even if his methods were unique. You'd see him using large quantities of sponges and, most notably, copious amounts of eau de cologne to refresh himself. He wasn't merely dabbing it on, he was applying it with a generous hand, almost as if bathing in it. Here's a quirky tidbit. He was, famously, almost comically, devoted to a specific cologne, Jean-Marie Farina's Eau de Cologne, which he used with an almost compulsive frequency. He'd reportedly consume bottles of it, not just dabbing it on his skin and clothing, but, astonishingly, even sometimes adding it to his drinks, believing it had genuine health benefits and invigorating properties. Imagine the crisp, vibrant scent of citrus, rosemary, and lavender almost perpetually surrounding the emperor, a distinctive, almost overpowering olfactory signature of power that preceded and followed him wherever he went. Then there were the more intimate, almost uncomfortable details of his personal upkeep, the physical realities that even an emperor could not escape. Historians still argue whether some of his chronic physical ailments, which often manifested during these private moments, were exacerbated by his relentless schedule and unimaginable stress, or perhaps simply by the primitive medical understanding and practices of the era. You might notice him occasionally pressing a hand to his jaw, a subtle, pained gesture, or a fleeting grimace crossing his features, a silent acknowledgement of the persistent toothache he often suffered from. Indeed, the state of his teeth and their often poor condition is a topic of ongoing scholarly debate, with some linking it to his demanding diet, his rapid eating, or even his underlying temperament and stress levels. You sense a profound vulnerability in these fleeting moments of physical discomfort, a stark and surprising contrast to the formidable, unyielding figure he presented to the world. Even an emperor, it turns out, couldn't escape the mundane, often irritating realities of human physiology, nor the sometimes uncomfortable demands of personal care, especially in an age when dentistry was still largely in its brutal infancy. These small, private struggles offered a glimpse of the man behind the myth, a testament to the human condition that unites us all, even across centuries and titles. After the rigorous, almost relentless demands of governing, the quiet intensity of his reading, and the somewhat formal setting of dinner, you might instinctively expect Napoleon to collapse into an immediate, exhausted slumber. But for a mind as restless, as driven, and as perpetually active as his, even true relaxation was often, in its own way, a disciplined pursuit, a deliberate shift in focus rather than a complete cessation of activity. He sought recreation, yes, but often of a kind that still subtly engaged his formidable intellect or allowed for a measured, controlled release of tension, never a complete abandonment of mental vigilance. You might observe him in the evenings, not always retreating to bed immediately after the last plate was cleared, but perhaps settling into a comfortable, albeit often plain, armchair, with a book, a novel this time, perhaps rather than a military treatise, or even a volume of poetry. It's a mainstream historical fact that he genuinely enjoyed literature beyond the dry historical and military texts that dominated his daytime reading, finding a particular, almost surprising, solace in the works by authors like Rousseau, Voltaire, and even Goethe. He was known to recite lines of poetry from memory, sometimes to himself, sometimes to a companion, a surprisingly sensitive and almost romantic facet from a man so often characterized by ruthless pragmatism and unyielding ambition. Imagine the emperor who could crush armies and reshape the map of Europe, finding quiet, intimate pleasure in the turn of a poetic phrase, the rhythm of a well-crafted verse. This, you realize, was his preferred method of unwinding, a profound mental escape rather than a purely physical one, a way to transport his mind beyond the confines of his immediate imperial burdens. Sometimes, if the mood struck him, or if he sought a different kind of mental engagement, you might catch a glimpse of him engaging in a game of chess. He was a keen, if not always consistently brilliant, player, treating the chessboard not merely as a game board, but as a miniature battlefield. You could almost see him strategizing his moves, weighing the risks and rewards of each piece's position, just as he would on a grander, continental scale. This wasn't merely a casual pastime. It was another form of intense mental exercise, a way to keep his strategic mind sharp, honed, and agile even in moments of leisure. He often played quickly, sometimes impatiently, reflecting his general temperament. And here's a quirky tidbit that reveals a fascinating, slightly mischievous crack in his imperial facade. He was known, on occasion, to sometimes cheat subtly. In chess, nudging a piece a square or two further, or quietly replacing a captured piece when his opponent wasn't looking. It was a small, almost childish act, but a deeply revealing glimpse into his fiercely competitive nature and his overwhelming desire to win, even in trivial matters, highlighting his aversion to defeat in any form. He was also notably fond of taking walks, often in the palace gardens, or later on the restricted grounds of his island exiles. These weren't aimless, leisurely strolls designed for quiet contemplation of nature. You might see him deep in thought, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the manicured bushes. He was likely still processing the day's complex events, meticulously replaying conversations, or mulling over future plans and contingencies. Historians still argue whether these seemingly relaxed walks were truly moments of genuine rest and psychological recuperation, or simply another venue for continuous, uninterrupted strategic thinking, a way to untangle complex problems by literally walking through them, allowing the rhythm of his steps to synchronize with the rhythm of his thoughts. You sense that even in his moments of quiet, his mind was never truly still, never truly at peace, always processing, always analyzing, always planning, always ready for the next challenge, the next strategic maneuver, the next chapter in his relentless ambition. His idea of recreation, you conclude, was simply a different, perhaps slightly softer, form of engagement for an ever-active, relentlessly creative mind. For a man who shaped an empire, dictated the destinies of millions, and commanded the awe and fear of an entire continent, Napoleon's private family moments often presented a stark and often poignant contrast to his formidable public persona. You might instinctively imagine a serene domestic tableau, filled with warmth and quiet affection, befitting a powerful monarch. But the reality was frequently far more complex, tinged with a blend of genuine, if sometimes strained, affection. sharp strategic calculation, and the undeniable, relentless pressures of his monumental role. These were the rare moments where the emperor, at least figuratively, shed his uniform and became simply a husband, a father, or a brother, though often with a profound difficulty in truly disconnecting from the imperial burden. You might observe him, perhaps in the twilight hours of an evening at Malmaison, the scent of roses wafting through the open windows, interacting with his first wife, Josephine. Their relationship, as you've undoubtedly learned, was a tempestuous, almost operatic blend of passionate, consuming love and shrewd political ambition. In these deeply private moments, when the world outside their immediate circle was momentarily forgotten, you might catch fleeting glimpses of tenderness, a soft, murmured word exchanged between them, a shared, understanding glance across a quiet room, or the gentle touch of his hand on hers. These small gestures hinted at the deep, almost unbreakable bond that once existed, forged in the fires of their early, turbulent years. Yet, even in their most intimate moments, the ever-present shadow of his imperial need for an heir loomed. Large, a dark, unspoken presence in the room. It's a mainstream historical fact that his ultimate, agonizing decision to divorce Josephine, despite his enduring affection for her, was driven by the cold, political imperative to secure the succession of his nascent dynasty, to ensure the future of his empire above all else. You might, if you listened closely enough, hear the quiet, almost melancholic tone in his voice during these difficult conversations, a rare crack in his otherwise impenetrable, unyielding facade of iron will. Later, with his second wife, Marie Louise, the atmosphere of their domesticity was distinctly different, less passionate fire, more calculated warmth. Their union was, first and foremost, a political alliance, painstakingly designed to legitimize his rule among the old, established European monarchies, to blend the raw power of the revolutionary emperor with the ancient lineage of the Habsburgs. You'd observe a more formal, perhaps even slightly awkward, domesticity, especially in the early days. Yet, surprisingly, despite the political origins of their marriage, he grew genuinely fond of her, and even more so, he absolutely adored their son, Napoleon II, famously known as the King of Rome. Here's a quirky tidbit that melts the heart of the Iron General. He would often play with his young son, sometimes even getting down on the floor on his hands and knees. A surprisingly human and immensely endearing sight from the world's most powerful man. He'd throw small objects for the child to retrieve, or gently tussle with him, perhaps even allowing himself to be defeated in a playful mock battle. These were moments of pure, unadulterated paternal affection and joy, offering a rare, luminous window into his softer, more vulnerable side, revealing the man beneath the legend. However, historians still actively argue whether these brief, often fleeting periods of domesticity provided true emotional respite for Napoleon, a genuine escape from his monumental burdens, or if he remained fundamentally isolated by the immense, crushing weight of his power and ambition. Did he truly switch off from the emperor role, fully immersing himself in family life, or was even his domestic sphere subtly, inexorably influenced by his grand designs, his need for control, and his relentless pursuit of legacy? You sense that, while he undoubtedly craved genuine connection and moments of unburdened human affection, the very nature of his boundless ambition and the overwhelming weight of his responsibilities often made such moments fleeting, precious, and ultimately bittersweet. The gilded palace walls, for all their grandeur and beauty, often confined rather than liberated the emperor in his most private hours, subtly turning even family life into another complex theater for the man who was always, first and foremost, a ruler, a strategist, an architect of empire. The personal often succumbed to the political, even in the most intimate corners of his life. As the long day of governing, reading, strategizing, and the nuanced dance of dinner finally drew to a close, you might expect Napoleon to seek a profound, undisturbed, and deeply restorative sleep, allowing his formidable mind and body to completely shut down. But for a mind as restless, as driven, and as perpetually active as his, even slumber was often intricately intertwined with strategy, a continuation of his day's intense mental exertions rather than a complete, blissful escape. His nocturnal habits were as unique and unyielding as his waking ones, deeply influencing his decisions, his temperament, and ultimately, the very fabric of his legendary legacy. You watch as he prepares for bed, often with surprising brevity and an almost military efficiency. He wasn't one for lengthy, elaborate bedtime rituals, no drawn-out preparations or pampering. His valets would assist him with the removal of his day clothes and the donning of simple nightwear. But the entire process was quick and efficient, a mere transition. It's a mainstream historical fact that Napoleon famously required very little sleep, often subsiding on just 4 to 5 hours a night, sometimes even less during periods of intense military campaigns or pressing crises. Imagine, if you can, trying to run a sprawling empire, managing armies, and outmaneuvering coalitions, all while operating on such a profound and continuous sleep deficit. He genuinely believed that prolonged sleep was a weakness, a drain on his vital mental faculties, a luxury he simply could not afford in his relentless pursuit of power and dominion. You might observe him, even as he lies down on his bed, his eyes still seemingly alert, perhaps gazing at the ceiling, his mind already formulating the next day's complex plans or meticulously replaying the day's critical conversations, dissecting every word, every nuance. He often woke briefly, yet quite deliberately, in the middle of the night, not in a state of confused awakening, but with a clear purpose. Sometimes it was to scribble down a sudden, brilliant thought that had come to him in his semi-slumberer, crucial military maneuver, a diplomatic opening, or a profound political insight that had crystallized in the quiet hours. His bedside table would always be meticulously prepared, a candle ready to be lit instantly, along with writing materials, paper, quill, and ink, all within easy reach for these nocturnal bursts of inspiration. This was his version of a midnight oil session, a private, uninterrupted continuation of his work, untouched by the demands of courtiers, the clamor of the day, or the endless parade of petitioners. Here's a quirky tidbit. He was known to sometimes take a short, invigorating, and reputedly very cold bath in the middle of the night. If he woke up feeling sluggish or found his thoughts less than perfectly clear, this brisk, almost shocking immersion was designed to re-energize his mind, to shake off any lingering sleepiness before he returned to bed for another hour or two of restless slumber. Historians still argue whether his limited sleep was a purely natural physiological trait, a unique genetic predisposition that allowed him to function optimally on minimal rest, or if it was a disciplined habit he meticulously cultivated, believing it gave him an insurmountable edge over his more conventional, sleep-loving adversaries. Was he genuinely able to function at peak performance on so little rest? Or did this chronic sleep deprivation subtly contribute to his often mercurial temperament, his periods of intense irritability, and perhaps even to his eventual decline in health and judgment in later years. You sense the constant hum of his prodigious brain, even when his body was at rest, a mind that simply refused to be truly dormant, always processing, always calculating. His sleep was not a surrender to exhaustion, but rather another strategic pause, a time when the subconscious continued to wrestle with the complexities of empire, often delivering fresh, intuitive insights that would be acted upon with decisive speed the following morning. The stillness of the night in Napoleon's chambers was not empty. It was filled with the silent, relentless churnings of a monumental intellect perpetually at work. Despite his formidable willpower, his almost superhuman endurance, and his seemingly inexhaustible energy, Napoleon was, at the end of the day, a mortal man, undeniably susceptible to the same physical ailments and vulnerabilities that plagued his humblest subjects. You might sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of the immense physical toll his relentless ambition, his ceaseless campaigning, and his crushing responsibilities took on him. These were moments where the iron facade of the emperor momentarily faltered, subtly revealing a body often racked by discomfort, pain, and persistent illness. These deeply personal struggles with health, often compounded by what many observers perceived as a degree of hypochondria, were a constant, if often carefully hidden companion throughout his adult life. You might notice him occasionally pressing a hand to his side, a subtle, almost involuntary gesture, or a fleeting grimace crossing his otherwise impassive features, a silent acknowledgement of an internal torment. It's a mainstream historical fact that Napoleon suffered from various acute and chronic digestive issues, particularly intense stomach pain and possibly ulcers, for much of his adult life, starting even in his younger years. This debilitating discomfort was often attributed to a nervous stomach, a common diagnosis of the era for stress-related gastrointestinal problems, undoubtedly exacerbated by the immense, unimaginable stress of governing an empire constantly at war and making life or death decisions daily. Imagine the constant gnawing pain, a silent, unseen battle fought within his own body, running concurrently with his grander, external military campaigns. These persistent gastric complaints often profoundly influenced his dietary choices, leading him to prefer simpler, blander foods, avoiding anything rich or highly spiced, and certainly contributing to his famously rapid eating habits, perhaps an unconscious attempt to get the disagreeable act of eating over with as quickly as possible, to minimize the post-meal discomfort. Beyond his recurrent stomach ailments, he was also prone to the common maladies of the era: colds, bouts of flu, and a myriad of minor complaints that, to his active, often anxious mind, frequently seemed far more serious and ominous than they truly were. You might see him, even indoors, bundled up against a perceived chill, or hear him complaining bitterly of a draft, his sensitivity to temperature often noted by those around him. Here's a quirky tidbit: he was known to rely heavily on remedies, an advice suggested by his mother Laetitia Bonaparte, a woman renowned for her practical, no-nonsense approach to life and a rather traditional, often superstitious, approach to health. He might have tried a specific poultice for a swelling, or a particular herbal tea for a cough. Simple folk remedies that stood in stark contrast to the burgeoning, more scientific medical theories being developed by his imperial physicians. This almost childlike reliance on his mother's traditional wisdom speaks volumes about a deeper, almost poignant vulnerability beneath the imperious, unyielding exterior of the emperor. Historians still argue whether his perceived hypochondria, his tendency to exaggerate minor ailments or fear imaginary ones, his constant worry about his health, was a psychological coping mechanism for the overwhelming, almost unbearable pressures he faced, a way to externalize internal anxieties. Or, conversely, if it genuinely stemmed from a body worn down by incessant stress, chronic sleep deprivation, and the rigors of constant campaigning, making him genuinely more susceptible to illness. Did his anxieties about his health sometimes cloud his judgment, leading to overly cautious decisions? Or were they merely a relatable human foible, a common vulnerability in an otherwise extraordinary, almost mythical figure? You sense the profound paradox of this mighty emperor, capable of inspiring fervent devotion and widespread terror on an unprecedented scale, yet privately tormented by a sensitive stomach, a persistent cough, or an imagined malaise. These hidden, intimate battles against his own physiology were a constant, humbling reminder that even the most powerful men are ultimately bound by the immutable limitations of their physical form. A reminder of the shared human condition that transcends all titles and triumphs. Beyond the grand pronouncements, the sweeping imperial decrees, and the thundering commands issued on battlefields, much of Napoleon's daily life, especially during his periods in residence, was consumed by the relentless, often overwhelming, flow of correspondence. You'd often find him not just signing documents that had been prepared for him, but actively dictating new letters, meticulously reading incoming dispatches, and annotating a veritable torrent of communications that connected him like a vast, intricate nervous system to every corner of his sprawling empire. This was his primary lifeline, the vital network through which he maintained absolute control, gathered critical intelligence from distant fronts, and expressed his precise, unwavering will to his marshals, ministers, and prefects. You observe him at his desk, often surprisingly cluttered with towering stacks of incoming mail, each one a potential challenge or opportunity awaiting his decisive hand. His secretaries, a dedicated and perpetually busy corps of individuals, would meticulously sift through the volume, but the most important dispatches, the most urgent reports, always found their way directly to him, untouched by lesser hands. It's a mainstream historical fact that Napoleon was an incredibly prolific letter writer, dictating thousands upon thousands of letters throughout his career, a staggering output that speaks to his relentless engagement. These weren't just dry official documents filled with bureaucratic jargon. They were often vibrant, incisive, and filled with highly detailed instructions, sharp critiques of performance, profound strategic insights, and sometimes, surprisingly, personal asides that offered a glimpse into the man behind the emperor. You might hear the rapid-fire cadence of his voice as he dictated to a secretary, his thoughts flowing faster than the quill could keep up, his words tumbling out in a torrent of ideas. He would often circle back to clarify a point, demand more precision, or add a new, unexpected directive, ensuring absolute clarity and adherence to his vision. His correspondence, far more than any public speech, truly revealed not only his strategic brilliance, but also the intricate nuances of his character. He could be incredibly impatient, demanding immediate answers and swift, unhesitating execution. You might see him underlining phrases in frustration, his pen digging into the paper, or scrawling angry marginal notes if a report was vague, a request poorly articulated, or an order insufficiently carried out. Yet, in stark contrast, he could also be surprisingly tender and affectionate in letters to Josephine, or deeply concerned in those to his family, revealing a different, softer facet of the man who ruled an empire with an iron fist. And here's a quirky tidbit that adds a surprising, almost whimsical layer to his intense focus. He often developed peculiar, sometimes urgent, cravings for specific foods during periods of intense work or profound stress. He would then send urgent requests for these items to be sent to him, no matter how far away he was from the imperial kitchens or his preferred purveyors. Imagine an express courier being dispatched across half of Europe, galloping through the night, simply because the emperor suddenly fancied a particular type of highly spiced chicken dish, or a very specific kind of biscuit from his childhood, a fleeting, almost mundane desire amidst the grand demands of his imperial life. Historians still argue whether his meticulous attention to even the most minute details in his correspondence, from troop deployments to kitchen supplies, was a sign of his exceptional administrative genius, a necessary grasp of all threads of control, or a manifestation of a deep-seated need for control and a tendency towards micromanagement, a reluctance to fully delegate. Did his constant, direct communication empower his subordinates by providing clear guidance, or did it stifle their initiative, making them hesitant to act without explicit instructions? You sense that for Napoleon, writing and receiving letters was more than just a duty. It was a fundamental aspect of his being, a vital way to extend his presence and his unyielding will across vast distances, ensuring that his vision for the empire was disseminated and executed with unwavering precision, even as his sometimes peculiar personal cravings dictated surprising logistical demands on his staff. His life was, in many ways, an endless conversation, carried out through the quill and the postal service. The sun that once cast long, imposing shadows from Napoleon's vast, conquering armies across the breadth of Europe eventually set on his personal freedom too, with exile, first a temporary reprieve on the comparatively gentle island of Elba, and then the crushing, definitive confinement to the remote, windswept volcanic outcrop of St. Helena. The routines you've so intimately observed, subtly, yet profoundly, began to shift. You find yourself now not in the gilded, echoing halls of the Tuileries Palace, alive with the murmur of courtiers and the rustle of important documents, but in the comparatively modest, often damp, and perpetually guarded confines of Longwood. House here, what Napoleon ate, drank, and thought about daily was no longer dictated by the strategic needs of an expanding empire or the demands of a bustling court, but chillingly by the stringent constraints of his British captors and the gnawing, inescapable reality of his irreversible confinement. His diet, once simple by deliberate choice and personal preference, now became even simpler by necessity, and often by the deliberate design of his distant, watchful guards. You might see him at the dinner table, no longer surrounded by his chosen inner circle, but by a handful of loyal companions, dining on tough, stringy mutton, stringy beef, and meager portions of often overcooked, unappetizing vegetables. The delicate flavors and preferred preparations he once enjoyed were replaced by a monotonous, uninspired repetition of bland, unvarying fare. It's a mainstream historical fact that the quality and variety of food provided to Napoleon on St. Helena was a constant, bitter source of complaint, not just for him but for his loyal entourage, who saw it as another deliberate indignity. Imagine the man who once commanded the vast resources of an entire continent, now reduced to haggling over the freshness of a local fish or the tenderness of a meager cut of meat with his British jailers. This profound indignity, more than the physical discomfort itself, likely gnawed incessantly at his immense pride, a daily reminder of his fallen status. His famous, almost compulsive, coffee habit remained a small, yet significant, source of comfort and mental clarity in his suffocating isolation. But even here, the quality could be maddeningly inconsistent. The beans often inferior, the brew weak. His reliance on cognac, however, seemed to subtly, almost imperceptibly, increase, perhaps as a more potent solace against the endless monotony, the soul-crushing boredom, and the profound frustration of his unchanging predicament. You might see him taking more frequent sips, the amber liquid offering a brief, fleeting escape from the grim, unchanging reality of his confinement, a momentary warmth against the inner chill of despair. And here's a quirky tidbit that reveals his enduring human spirit in deprivation. He became extremely, almost singularly, fond of a particular type of coffee, roasted by a local Chinese servant on the island, preferring its specific aroma and tastes above all others. This tiny, almost insignificant detail, the search for a singular, perfect cup of coffee, underscores his enduring ability to find small, consistent sources of pleasure and comfort amidst vast, overwhelming deprivation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of utter defeat. The shift in his thought patterns was perhaps the most poignant and profound change of all. No longer consumed by grand strategies of conquest, intricate military maneuvers, or the complex daily demands of governance, his powerful mind inexorably turned inward, becoming a vast archive of memory, a relentless engine of self-justification, and a meticulous architect of his own historical legacy. You'd find him spending countless hours dictating his voluminous memoirs to his loyal companions, particularly General Gougod and Count Las Casas, attempting with a desperate fervor to control the narrative of his extraordinary life, to immortalize his unparalleled achievements, and to eloquently settle old scores with his enemies and detractors. Historians still argue whether his detailed recounting of his past, often embellished, selectively remembered, or strategically reframed, was a genuine attempt at historical accuracy, a truthful reflection of his experiences, or a final, grand propaganda campaign, a literary offensive designed to salvage his tarnished reputation for posterity, to win the battle for history from his remote island prison. You sense a profound, almost aching melancholy in these relentless reflections, a powerful, restless mind tragically forced to relive past glories rather than create new ones. His vast, strategic intellect now a poignant prisoner of its own formidable past. The domesticity here was truly uncharted, stripped bare of all imperial grandeur, revealing the fundamental man beneath the legend, adapting, however unwillingly and bitterly, to a life utterly devoid of direct power, yet still fighting for dominion over his own story. The final, agonizing chapter of Napoleon's Uncharted Domesticity unfolded in the relentless, oppressive confines of St. Helena, a slow, arduous descent towards the inevitable end. You stand witness now, not to the grand theatrics of an emperor, but to the stark realities of a man facing his profound mortality, his vibrant spirit flickering under the relentless strain of illness and the crushing weight of isolation. Here, the grand narratives of battles, of political intrigue, and of imperial ambition faded into insignificance, replaced by the stark, undeniable truths of a human being whose daily existence was reduced to its most elemental forms: the consumption of dwindling sustenance and the profound, relentless act of reflection, his diet. Already Spartan and lacking variety due to his captivity, became increasingly limited as his health deteriorated. You might see him refusing food altogether, pushing away plates, his appetite waning, his constant stomach pains worsening with agonizing regularity. It's a mainstream historical fact that he suffered from severe stomach illness during his final years on St. Helena, often attributed by modern historians to gastric cancer, though the exact cause remains a subject of some debate. The simple, often bland dishes that once sustained him now brought only profound discomfort, exacerbating his internal torment. His once robust, though never large, frame grew noticeably thinner, almost skeletal, his face becoming gaunt, etched with pain and weariness. His eyes, still retaining a glimmer of their old, piercing intensity, now held a deep, melancholic shadow of exhaustion. His loyal companions, faithful to the very end, tried every known remedy, every comforting dish they could conjure, but to little avail. Imagine the utter futility of offering a carefully prepared, simple meal to a man whose very organs were betraying him, consumed by an unseen, internal enemy. His famous, almost indispensable, coffee and his preferred cognac, once sources of boundless energy and profound solace, to gradually lost their appeal in his final, weakening days. You might observe him taking only sips of plain water, or perhaps a highly diluted wine, as even the strong stimulants became too much for his failing, fragile system, no longer offering comfort, only adding to his nausea. Here's a quirky tidbit that offers a poignant flash of his old self, a testament to his enduring will even in the face of death. Despite his rapidly declining health, he occasionally showed surprising, almost defiant, flashes of his former, imperious self, suddenly asking for specific, highly spiced dishes from his youth, almost as if trying to reassert control over his taste buds, or perhaps desperately seeking a fleeting memory of past pleasures and vigor. These sudden, intense cravings were, however, brief and ephemeral, quickly giving way to renewed discomfort and a deeper plunge into his suffering as his body weakened. Day by day, hour by hour, his mind, still remarkably lucid at times, turned almost entirely to the past and to the urgent future of his unparalleled legacy. You sense him reliving his greatest triumphs on the battlefield, his most astute political maneuvers, and his most devastating defeats, meticulously crafting the narrative he passionately wished the world to remember. He spent countless hours dictating to his loyal companions, refining his voluminous memoirs, ensuring that his version of history, his explanation of events, would prevail against the accusations of his enemies. Historians still argue whether his final pronouncements and the incredibly detailed accounts he left were accurate historical records, unbiased truths, or a final, grand, desperate attempt to shape his own image, to win the ultimate battle for his reputation from the remote confines of his island prison. You watch as he drifts in and out of consciousness, his breath growing shallower, his once thunderous, commanding voice reduced to a frail, almost inaudible whisper. His last thoughts, as painstakingly reported by those few devoted souls at his side, were of France, of the army he so deeply loved, and of Josephine, his first great love, a profoundly poignant blend of empire, unwavering loyalty, and cherished, irretrievably lost love. The man who ate little and thought constantly, the colossus who bestrode Europe, finally lay still, his uncharted domestic life, however complex and revealing, profoundly concluded.